Welcome to the O Horror Podcast. Join me as I take you on a journey of the senses and the mind into the darkness. Sit back, relax, and enjoy today's story. In September of the year 1811, a little boy arrived at the door of Aswarby Hall in the middle of Lincolnshire. He rang the bell and looked around him at the tall, square 18th century house. An evening light fell on the building, making the windows shine like fires. In front of the hall, there was a park full of trees and a church with a clock. It all seemed very pleasant to the boy, as he waited for someone to open the door. The boy's parents were dead, and his elderly cousin, Mr. Abney, warned him to go and live at Aswarby. People who knew Mr. Abney were surprised at his offer because they thought he was a man who loved books more than people, and who preferred to live alone. Mr. Abney opened the door and seemed happy to see his young cousin, Stephen Elliott. He immediately started to ask questions. "How old are you, my boy? How are you? And how old are you? I hope you're not too tired to eat your supper." "No, thank you, sir. I'm quite well." "Good. And how old are you, my boy?" It seemed strange that he asked the question twice in the first 2 minutes of the conversation. "I'm 12 years old next birthday." "And when is your birthday, my dear boy?" 11th of September, eh? That's good. That's very good. I like to write these things down in my book. Are you sure you'll be 12? "Yes, sir, quite sure." "Well, take him to Mrs. Bunch's room, Parks, and let him have his supper there." Mrs. Bunch was the friendliest person at Aswarby. Stephen felt comfortable with her, and they became good friends in a quarter of an hour. He was 55 years old and knew everything about the house and the neighbourhood. She was quite willing to share this information with Stephen, and there were certainly many things about Aswarby Hall and gardens that the boy wanted to ask her. One November evening, Stephen was sitting by the fire in Mrs. Bunch's room, thinking about this new home. "Is Mr. Abney a good man?" he asked suddenly. "Good, my child? He's the kindest man I've ever known. Haven't I told you about the little boy he brought here from the street 7 years ago? Or the little girl he brought 2 years after I started working here?" "No, please tell me about them, Mrs. Bunch." "Well, I don't remember much about the little girl. Mr. Abney brought her back from his walk one day and told Mrs. Ellis to take care of her. The poor child had no family. She lived with us for about 3 weeks, and then one morning she got up while everyone was asleep and left the house. Never seen her again. Mr. Abney looked everywhere, but she never came back. She was a very silent child, but she helped me out a lot, and I loved her very much." "And what about the little boy?" That poor boy. He came here one winter day playing his music, and Mr. Abney asked him lots of questions such as, 'Where do you come from? How old are you? Where are your family?' He was very kind to the boy, but the same thing happened. He just disappeared." That night, Stephen had a strange dream. Near his bedroom, at the top of the house, there was an old bathroom which nobody used. The top of the door was made of glass, and it was possible to look in and see the bath. In his dream, Stephen looked through that glass and saw a body in the bath, a very thin, dusty body, with a sad smile and the hands pressed over the heart. As Stephen looked, a terrible cry came from the lips, and the arms began to move. Stephen was extremely frightened and woke up suddenly. He found that he was really standing on the cold floor near the bathroom. Bravely, he He looked through the glass again to see if the body was really there or not. He went back to bed. When they heard about Stephen's experience, Mrs. Bunch and Mr. Abney were very interested, and Mrs. Bunch put a new curtain over the glass door of the bathroom. Mr. Abney said he would write about Stephen's dream in his book. It was nearly spring when two more strange things happened. The first was that Stephen passed another very uneasy night, and the next day he saw Mrs. Bunch mending his nightshirt. She seemed rather angry with him and asked, "How did you manage to tear your nightshirt so badly? It took me a long time to mend this." Stephen looked and saw there were some cuts in the shirt, a few inches long. "I don't remember how it happened. I don't remember anything, but they're just the same as the scratches on the outside of my bedroom door." Mrs. Bunch looked at him, her mouth open, and then ran upstairs to see. "Well, it's very strange. I wonder how the scratches appeared. They're too high for a dog, a cat, or a rat to make. Don't say anything to Mr. Abney, but remember, lock your door when you go to bed tonight." "Oh, I always do." The next evening, the second strange thing happened. Mr. Parks, the servant, visited Stephen and Mrs. Bunch in Mrs. Bunch's room. He did not come often to see them there. When he came in, he didn't at first notice that Stephen was there. He seemed very nervous and uneasy. "Mr. Abney will have to get his own wine if he wants to drink in the evenings. If I can't go down and get it in the daytime, I won't go at all. There's something strange down there in the house, you know. Maybe it's the wind, or maybe it's rats, so I don't think so. I don't like it." "Don't talk like that. You'll frighten young Stephen." Mr. Parks suddenly noticed Stephen for the first time and quickly said with a nervous laugh, "Oh, I was only joking, you know." But Stephen knew it wasn't a joke, and he was worried. He asked a lot of questions, but Mr. Parks refused to tell him anything else about the noises under the house. It was now March 24th, 1812. A strange day, windy and noisy. Stephen stood in the garden and pretended the wind was full of ghosts, people he couldn't see who were flying in the wind and trying to contact living people in the real world. After lunch that day, Mr. Abney said, "Stephen, my boy, will you come to the library late tonight at, say, 11 o'clock? I'll be busy until then, but I want to show you something about your future life. Don't tell Mrs. Bunch or anyone else in the house, just go to your room at the usual time." Stephen was excited. He could stay up until 11 o'clock. He looked in at the library door when he was on his way upstairs that evening, and he saw on the table a silver cup filled with red wine and an old piece of paper with words on it. At about 10 o'clock, Stephen was standing at the open window of his bedroom, looking out over the nighttime countryside. The wind was not so strong now, and there was a full moon. Suddenly he heard some strange cries, perhaps someone lost in the night, or water birds down on the lake in the park. The noises grew louder and came nearer the house. Then they stopped. But just as Stephen was about to close his window and continue reading his book, he saw two children standing outside under the dark trees, a boy and a girl. They stood together, looking up at his window. The girl reminded him of the girl in his dream about the bath, and the sight of the boy made him feel afraid. The girl was smiling, holding her hands over her heart. The boy, with his untidy black hair and old clothes, stretched his hands out helplessly in front of him. His fingernails were very long and dirty. As the boy stood there with his arms held out, Stephen suddenly saw something which made his hair stand on end. He couldn't believe his eyes. There, on the left side of the boy's chest, was a large black hole. Again, Stephen heard the children's terrible, sad cries. Then it disappeared. Although he was badly frightened, Stephen decided to go to Mr. Abney's library anyway. It was now nearly 11 o'clock. He walked very fast through the dark old house, quiet at this time of night with all the servants in bed. But when he arrived at the library, the door wouldn't open. It was not locked, and the key was on the outside, but when he knocked there was no answer. He listened carefully, and he heard Mr. Abney speaking. No, crying out. But why? Perhaps he too could see the strange children. Then suddenly, everything was quiet, and the library door opened by itself. Mr. Abney was in his chair, his head thrown back and his eyes wide, with a look of terrible fear and pain on his face. On the left side of his cheek was a large hole, and Stephen could see his heart. But there was no blood on his hands, and the long knife on the table was completely clean. The window of the library was open, and the wind blew the curtains in a terrible dance. An old book was open on the table, and this is what Stephen read. Thousands of years ago, people discovered you could control the world. Fly, disappear, or become someone or something else, all by magic. But to be able to use this magic, it is necessary first to take out the hearts of 3 young people under 21 years of age. I have spent almost 20 years carefully choosing 3 young people who I could kill without anyone noticing. First was Phoebe Stanley on March 24th, 1791. Second, an Italian boy, Giovanni Paoli, on March 23rd, 1805, and tonight, on March 24th, 1812, the last child to die for me will be my cousin, Stephen Elliott. No one will ever find the bodies of these children. I've hidden the first 2 in my wine cellar under the floor, and I'll do the same with the 3rd child tonight. The ghosts of these children may come back, the books tell me, crying horribly. They may try to take the heart from the man who killed them, but this will not happen to me, I'm sure. Stephen finished reading and looked at the body of his elderly cousin. Quietly, he left the room and closed the door. For many years, people wondered about Mr. Abney's death. It must have been a wild cat that came in through the window and killed the poor man, they said. But only Stephen knew the truth. Martin's Lake. I was staying with a good friend of mine in the West Country. I arrived on the Friday night. My friend was keen to show me the village on the Saturday morning. I'll take you round and I'll show you everything. They want you to meet a friend of mine, John Hill. He's about 70 years old and knows all the history of the village. Oh, and make sure you ask him about Martin's Lake. Why? Is that a good place for fishing? He laughed. No, but there's no water in it now. But let old John tell you the story. I'm sure he'll enjoy it. The next day, after the tour of the village, we went to old John Hill's house for tea. We persuaded the old man to tell us the story of the lake. It was the Christmas of 1683, and a young gentleman, George Martin, returned from Cambridge University to the village. He was a popular young man and used to ride his horse long distances to visit his friends in the neighbourhood. One night it was snowing hard, so instead of riding all the way to his house outside the village, he decided to stay at the small hotel here. As it was Christmas, there was music and dancing in the hotel, and all the young men and women were dancing together, except one. Her name was Anne Clark, and she worked at the hotel. She was an innocent young girl, not very intelligent. In fact, people used to laugh at her behind her back, and, of course, none of the young men wanted to dance with her. But George Martin the young gentleman took pity on her and asked her to dance. The band were playing this old song called "Lady, Will You Walk, Will You Talk With Me?" Everyone saw how happy the poor girl was to have someone to dance with. Her face just lit up with a smile. After that night, the young gentleman came to the hotel every week. When he arrived on his horse, he used to sing that song, and Anne Clark used to rush out to meet him as soon as she heard it. The two often went for walks together by the lake, and some people say they saw them kiss. This went on for a few months until George Martin's parents found a wife for him. She was beautiful, rich, young woman from a very good family. Everyone saw how lucky George Martin was, but then it all went wrong. The young woman heard about Anne Clark and was angry that a gentleman like him went about with an ordinary country girl, and she refused to marry him. He, of course, regretted ever meeting Anne and was very angry to lose such a beautiful young wife. People say that the next time he saw Anne, they argued and he hit her. A week later, they were seen together again. He said a few words to her and then rode off. They say she looked very happy all that day, but not long after, she disappeared completely. No one could find her anywhere. Some weeks later, George Martin came into the hotel again, went into the bar and asked for a drink. A young woman called Sarah, a friend of Anne Clark, served him. "Are you looking for Anne, sir?" she asked. "Because no one has seen her for weeks." He answered angrily no, he was not looking for her, and he sat alone, drinking his beer. Sarah began to wash some dishes and, without thinking, began to sing the song, "Lady, will you walk, will you talk with me?" The young gentleman's face turned pale, and he told her to stop singing immediately. She stopped, of course, but then suddenly she heard Anne's voice outside the door, continuing the song. "It's Anne! She's back!" Sarah cried, and ran towards the door. "Stop!" shouted George Martin, but it was too late. The door opened, and a strong, cold wind blew out all the lamps, leaving the room completely dark. Sarah heard someone walk across the floor, and the door of the big cupboard opened and shut. When she lit the lamps again, she saw something that looked like the bottom of a woman's dress caught under the cupboard door. Sarah was frightened and asked one of the men in the bar to open up the cupboard. As the man pulled open the cupboard door, George screamed and ran out of the bar into the street. Out of the cupboard came a small human shape, dressed in clothes that looked wet. No one saw its face, but everyone felt a freezing wind as it passed through the bar and into the darkness outside. The next person to see George was a young boy who was coming home from fishing at the lake. He said he saw the young gentleman running towards the water, looking very frightened. He broke a branch off a tree and started to feel around in the water with it. After some minutes, the branch hit something, and a strange sound like a scream came from deep in the lake. George covered his scars with his hands and started to scream also. As he did, the boy saw a human shape come out of the water and chase the young gentleman away into the trees. The boy ran and called the police. They found the body of Anne Clark at the bottom of the lake, and under a tree was George Martin's knife covered in blood. He was guilty of murder, of course, and they hanged him 5 weeks later. After that, everyone knew it as Martin's Lake, although it's dry now, and do you know that even now, no one will sing that song in this village? People say it's unlucky.